Welcome to the duckmilkprod YouTube channel. My name is Rebecca Johnson, and I like to talk about films as well as film criticism and analysis. And because of that, I wanted to share my thoughts on an article from Variety.com and an interview featuring Christopher Nolan and Zhang Shu, in which Nolan addresses amateur film criticism and his cinematic adaptation of the Odyssey. And what I think is particularly fascinating about this is because there's something that I think a lot of the big trades are missing about this conversation is that while they disparage quote amateur film critics, the best interview with the most thought-provoking questions about the Odyssey was actually conducted by an amateur film critic with a podcast. So I think that is incredibly fascinating that people are getting all of these things out there and they're saying all of these things. But what they're actually saying is kind of not what they mean, I think. So the the amateur film critic with a podcast is actually the one who actually has the best interview, is asking the best questions, is getting the most interesting responses from Christopher Nolan. And somehow amateur film criticism is not a real thing that anyone should take seriously. I personally think that's pretty fascinating as someone who considers myself an amateur film critic and someone who does have a podcast. You can check me out at supergirlradio.com. So there are things that I think are really interesting about both this article and the interview that we're going to talk about, because there were a lot of things that were said that I really just wanted to talk about and discuss. So if you happen to be watching live, feel free to share your thoughts in the live chat and we'll discuss it together. So the interview that we're going to talk about is from Zhang Shu. So if you're interested in Zhang Shu's podcast, I've linked it in the video description below of this live stream. It is in Mandarin though, so if you don't speak Mandarin, you might not get anything out of it. But if you are interested in the podcast and do speak the language, it's called Monologues of a Committed Observer. So definitely check it out if you are able to understand the language. I can't. I don't speak Mandarin. But if she's talking about things in the thoughtful way that she did with Christopher Nolan, I think it would probably be a pretty good listen. Okay, so I think I would like to start talking about this variety article. Now, there were a lot of articles that came out about this similar topic, particularly going after amateur film criticism is what all of the titles said. But we're going to use the Variety article as kind of a jumping off point to talk about amateur film criticism and the interview with Zhang Shu. So the title of this article, which I have linked in the video description below, is called Christopher Nolan on the Fundamental Flaw with Amateur Film Criticism, and was written by Maya Kupulin of Variety.com. So we're just going to kind of hit the high notes of this article and then get into the interview that it's discussing. So the Variety article reads, quote, while on the Odyssey press tour, the director, Christopher Nolan, spoke with podcaster Zhang Shu about a, quote, fundamental flaw of film criticism, unquote, he sees with amateur critics. Now, Christopher Nolan doesn't name these amateur critics, so we don't know who he's referring to exactly. It's a pretty wide net. It could be YouTubers, it could be podcasters, it could be academics, it could be bloggers. Who knows who he's referring to? He does not name anyone. So this is something that we're just going to have to guess about. It goes on to say, and I guess this is Christopher Nolan saying, the criticism that's often leveled at movies in general is, oh, the character has to be made sympathetic. So the character is manipulated in different ways or changed in different ways, Nolan said. And then he continues saying, quote, and that's a fundamental flaw of film criticism in a way, or storytelling criticism, because to be able to identify the mechanism does not invalidate the mechanism, unquote. I was very confused about this when I first read these quotes and then listened and watched the interview, because it's so interesting to me that Nolan refers to this as a mechanism. Later on in the interview with Zhang Shu, he basically defines mechanism as he sees it as a trope. Tropes are something I'm much more familiar with, and we're going to talk about tropes in pretty and a lengthy kind of discussion. So it's very interesting that Nolan calls it a mechanism rather than a storytelling trope that's used quite a bit and is successful in storytelling, and that's why people use them. So when he talks about mechanisms, he's actually talking about tropes. So Nolan goes on to say in the Variety article, quote, I'm thinking, well, and this is from the interview with Zhang Shu, and they're quoting him. He says, quote, I'm thinking more of amateur criticism because they feel they've identified the mechanism. Because they feel like they've identified the mechanism, they feel that it invalidates it. That can be true of certain elements, and film grammar, film language evolves with that. So when a trope becomes too familiar to an audience, then it has to be changed. But we do, as filmmakers, avail ourselves of that common language. We build on that understanding. Our audience has seen many films and they understand that language, unquote. So I'm not entirely sure what he's talking about, these like vague things that I would only hazard to guess what he's referring to. I think it's really interesting because the Odyssey has gotten a very high Rotten Tomato score, which anyone who's watched this YouTube channel knows I care nothing for Rotten Tomatoes. I think Rotten Tomatoes is a terrible waste of space. I don't think it should exist. The tomato meter is garbage. We shouldn't be putting a number on film criticism. It's useless. But just to give it a perspective, Christopher Nolan is used to these high scores on Rotten Tomatoes. So the Odyssey has a 94% on Rotten Tomatoes. Some of his other films, Memento has a 94%. The Dark Knight has 94%. Oppenheimer had 93%. Insomnia had 92%. Dunkirk had 92%. The Following had 87%. The Dark Knight Rises had 87%. I don't know why these go down in these very small percentages. Like The Dark Knight Rises is a great film. I don't know. I don't know why that's so low compared to his other films. Inception has an 86%. That's crazy. Inception's one of his best films, in my opinion. Batman Begins has 85% on Rotten Tomatoes. So just to compare it in terms of the professional film criticism, Christopher Nolan gets these very high scores, this high praise from these top critics of Rotten Tomatoes that I have big beef with here on the duckmilkprod YouTube channel. But so comparatively, the professional film critics praise Nolan. They love him. They think he's great. I also am a big Christopher Nolan fan. I'm not disparaging him in any way, but just to compare with the Odyssey, YouTubers and podcasters were having issues with some of the things with the Odyssey. The very famously, some of the trailers for the Odyssey were getting downvoted. People were leaving negative comments and things like that. And so I think this is the first time, what I think is very interesting about this, I think this is the first time Christopher Nolan has actually gotten some negative feedback and pushback about the way he's telling stories and the choices that he's making. I don't think Nolan is very used to this, and so he's struggling with this a bit. And it seems like the people who offered the most pushback on the Odyssey were amateur film critics. And to be honest, I don't think they were totally invalid. I think there were criticisms, and especially after I have seen it. I've seen it 3 times. I watched it in IMAX all 3 times, not the 70 millimeter IMAX because I didn't get a chance to do that. I don't have a theater close to me, but I could see it in IMAX, and so I did. So I didn't see it quite the way Christopher Nolan intended, but I did my best. So I have seen it 3 times, and so I think some of the criticisms that have been lobbied at the film are very valid. So it's a very interesting thing that I don't think Nolan is very used to having to explain the things that he's doing. So the fact that he goes after the amateur film critics for identifying the mechanisms. I don't know that anyone that I've watched a lot of YouTube reviews of the Odyssey, and I've discussed it with friends of mine, family members of mine, and I don't know that anyone is saying, oh, well, he's using too many mechanisms. He's using too many tropes. So therefore his storytelling is not no good. I don't think that's the actual criticism that he's talking about. So I'm very confused with Christopher Nolan about this, where he's talking about the tropes. Um, so what I also want to point out about this is that maybe I'm not reading the film critics that Christopher Nolan is reading. Maybe he is reading some professional film critics that are really good at their jobs. Maybe they have excellent things to say, really add value to the film discussion. But the ones that I've read, and I've read quite a few, I've actually gone through a lot of professional reviews, and the ones that I have read are probably the first ones to criticize the use of tropes and complain that something isn't new or fresh. They always want to complain about something. The professional film critics, I think, are the ones who are the most uh apt to complain about a film, especially when they don't like it, when they want other choices to be made. They're the first ones to complain and say, I don't like this. So it's very, very funny to me that Christopher Nolan is saying that the amateur film critics are the ones who are attacking the mechanisms, whereas the professional film critics, they understand it. They know the value of having those mechanisms and those tropes. So that's for me a comparison that I find very jarring. I see this very differently than Christopher Nolan, from being on the other side of it. Of course, he's on the filmmaking side. I'm on the critical reception side and the amateur film critic side. So I see this very, very differently than he does. And I would say, if there was anything I'd want to say about Nolan's mechanisms or use of tropes, is that I think he didn't rely on them heavily enough. I don't think he used enough mechanisms or tropes. For me personally, and this is not going to be like an extensive review of the Odyssey, but for me, I don't think that there was enough in terms of like romantic tropes. I would have wanted to see more of a romance between Odysseus and Penelope, and maybe that's not the way it is in Homer's poem. Maybe there's not a real emphasis on that, but for me, that was something that was lacking in it. I didn't really feel anything when Odysseus went home to find Penelope. It was very, very thin, I thought, in terms of making me believe that this was something that he needed to do, was to get back to her. I didn't really feel like she was missing him very much. Like the emotion for me wasn't there. I didn't really feel the romance between those characters. So if he applied more tropes in the romantic genre, maybe I would have felt more for their relationship and those two characters. For me, I would have wanted a grander return for Odysseus when he finally gets back to Ithaca, and I would have wanted more from Odysseus's dog, who I think is named Argus. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure. I haven't read the Odyssey in a very, very long time, so I don't really care about the adaptation part of things. I'm just looking at it from a filmmaking point of view. But like, his dog waited for him all that time, and I didn't really feel much about it. It didn't really play as a big moment. It was just very subtle. So there are things there are tropes that Nolan could have relied on that he didn't, and he didn't rely on them heavily enough. There are tropes. There are a couple of tropes. I went to tvtropes.com. I've linked all of those in the video description below. It's an extensive website that really documents any trope you can think of, and is a very, very good resource in terms of any TV shows or films that you can think of. You can look up anything and find the tropes that are associated with that film or TV show, or even literature. So there's tropes I've linked to in terms of the Odyssey poem, and also the Odyssey, the Christopher Nolan film. And so just to give some examples of the tropes that I would maybe have wanted to see more of, the homeward journey, where the trope is basically a story where the main goal is to get home. I don't think the trope was really hit hard enough for that. Yes, Odysseus goes through some trials to get home, but he even says in the movie, like, he maybe didn't want to get home. Like that was some. Why would I care if the character didn't want to get home? Why should I care if he gets home? So that trope I think should have maybe been played up a little bit more. And then there's another trope, excuse my language, called Big Damn Reunion, and this is the what the whole story has been leading up to, is that a character X is finally reunited with character Y after weeks, months, and perhaps even years apart. This is where I felt like the Odysseus, Penelope, or even Odysseus and Telemachus reunion wasn't really very effective, in my opinion. So that was a trope that I felt like Nolan could have leaned a little harder into. There's also a trope called pet positive identification, which I think is, as a Supergirl fan, I think it's very funny that tvtropes.org has a panel with Supergirl and Streaky for this one. But pet positive identification says a character can be heavily disguised or even transformed, and their pet will be the first to recognize them. Nolan could have played this up way, 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 way more than he did. So there's that trope that I wish he would have hit harder. There's also a trope called something only they would say, where a character is in disguise or otherwise hidden and reveals their true identity deliberately or accidentally by saying or doing something only they would say or do. And I think that that could have been something that Nolan played up with Odysseus when he returns to Ithaca. So for Nolan to talk about tropes and these mechanisms and how the amateur film critics, he probably wasn't talking about me. He has no idea I exist. But for an example, if I think I'm an amateur film critic, that's not my problem with the Odyssey, is that he was using mechanisms or tropes. My argument is actually, you didn't use enough of them. You didn't use them hard enough. So that would be the thing that I would probably suggest to him, is that the use of those, I think, would have been much more effective if the pulling on those tropes maybe would have been hit a little harder. That's what I would have mentioned with him. So I do see some people in the chat. So if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in there. I see at Wallace David Sears says, do you think it's because he's so insulated in Hollywood? That's a great question. I don't know with Christopher Nolan. I know he, I like his approach to really thinking about these stories. I don't really know what his thought process is with things. I don't know if he's sheltered from. It seems like he is reading film criticism. He's receiving some sort of feedback. So I don't know what he's watching, who he's talking to. I have no idea. My guess is that, some of the, I noticed that there were some YouTube channels that were pretty loud about the Odyssey, and I'm not gonna say one thing or the other about that, but I think maybe they garnered some attention because they have very big audiences, and so maybe that's something that he was looking at. But for me, I think it's interesting because people on this who like this channel know that I'm a big Zack Snyder fan. And what I think is really cool about Zack Snyder is that he doesn't make these movies for other people. He makes his movies for himself. And I've always thought about that when I create something. I want to create something that I'm happy with, because you're never going to be able to please anybody else. And so the idea even that Christopher Nolan would care about the critics is strange to me. He's maybe the most popular, biggest name in filmmaking today. Christopher Nolan should not care what the critics think. He should make whatever movie he wants to make, because he can make whatever movie he wants to make in any format that he wants to make it in, and people will make that happen for him. So if I could advise Christopher Nolan on anything, not that he would care, but make movies for yourself. Be happy with your own product. So I don't know if he's insulated in Hollywood, but I hope that he makes movies for himself and not other people, because there's just no way that you're going to please other people. Dennis Medina in the chat says, I do think that big influencers should be considered as professional film critics by this point. Now, that's a good point. Why are some of these YouTube channels who have millions of subscribers not considered a professional film critic just because they are not registered in RottenTomatoes.com? And I think some of those people, to varying degrees, have a lot of good thoughts on things and are very familiar with the content of some of these things, especially with adaptations, and are people who watch films a lot. So I think that, the great thing about something like YouTube is that you have the ability to share your thoughts and opinions about anything. Anybody can. And so I think that's actually really cool, because then different perspectives get shared. And so for me, the like Rotten Tomatoes, you see a lot of the same things pop up. So it's nice to have fresh opinions on things, because everybody sees film differently. So I don't I don't I think that YouTubers, podcasters, bloggers, I think people like that should not be dismissed because they aren't professionals. Maybe they're not getting paid for it. I don't think people should be dismissed like that. If they have something good to share and they add value to the conversation, I think that's worth checking out. So if there's a person or a website or a channel that you like, hang around and support them, because I think it's something that I find valuable to hear other people's thoughts on. Of course, I form my own opinions, but after I form my opinion, I like to see what other people have to say, because maybe they've seen something or they think something that maybe I have missed. Let's see. And also, Dennis Medina says the movie made $1 billion in spite of a major hate campaign against it, which proves my point that Hollywood shouldn't make movies for social media. I agree with that. I think there was even a push. I can't remember if it was for the Odyssey, that influencers were not allowed to be part of the press junkets and things like that. Now, I do have I do have a little bit of a beef with influencers, just because I don't know that they are the people who are having the thoughtful conversations, or actually care about the thing that they are going to see. Sometimes it's a lot of getting access to things, and that goes for professional film critics too. That sometimes those people are not really doing it for the art of cinema; they are doing it for the parties, the gift bags, the swag bags. So some of that, I think, does need to be dialed back, in my opinion. In my ideal world with film criticism, and this will never happen, but what I would love to see with film criticism is that people don't write the reviews until after the movie comes out. A lot of times these reviews are written because they've gotten a screener, or they went to one showing of it and then they wrote the review. I would rather people have to watch the movies twice. Like, that should be a rule. That's my own personal rule for myself. I don't review anything until I've watched or consumed it twice, because the first time is just me kind of letting it sort of wash over me, and the second time is when I get a little more critical about it and analyze whatever I'm watching. And so I think 2 3 viewings helps you to dissect it a lot more. And a lot of film criticism today is, if at all, they might watch it once. But sometimes I'm kind of wondering if some of these critics are writing these reviews after watching a trailer, and and they don't actually write a thorough or honest review. And so I think there is something to be said about the way that film criticism could be changed for the better. And I think social media sometimes has a negative effect on that. So I don't know. I don't know what the fix for it is. I know my own personal fix for that kind of thing, to actually really care about making a review and actually giving movies a shot. Even if I end up not liking them, I try to at least give them a fair shake. So it's a tough line. I don't know that we're ever going to be able to go back from there. Yeah. So, all right, I'm going to continue on discussing the interview that I thought was so fascinating. I know a lot of people on X were talking about it, and rightfully so. It was a very staunch contrast to what we were seeing in the press junkets, which inevitably end up being like the same questions over and over again. So this is an interview that I've linked below. There's an interview with a podcaster and academic named Zhang Xu, who interviewed Christopher Nolan. And so these are the things from that interview that I kind of wanted to hit on, because Nolan said some things that were fascinating, but also frustrating for me personally. So we can discuss those. So in the interview with Zhang Shu, Nolan says, quote, once you ignore the theological underpinning of Xenia, and forgive me if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. It's probably not the actual way to say it, but this is how Christopher Nolan pronounced it. The underpinning of Xenia, what you realize is that it is what we in modern times call the golden rule, unquote. Which I think is strange to say that if you ignore the theological underpinning of Xenia, which one could argue that Nolan did in his take on the Odyssey by not featuring the Greek gods much at all. Athena, if you want to say that's who that was, that he doesn't feature the Greek gods. He maybe makes them like a PTSD hallucination, if you want to go with that interpretation. But the golden rule is theological. It's a famous teaching of Jesus found in Matthew 7:12 and Luke 31. Matthew 7:12 says, quote, so in everything do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets, unquote. And Luke 6:31 says, quote, do to others as you would have them do to you, unquote. So it's interesting to me that Nolan argues that quote, civilization depends on this rule and possibly is even defined by it, unquote. So conversely, though, he says that the concept of Xenia is more challenged than it ever has been. So I'm not personally, I don't know, maybe other people have thoughts about this, but I'm not entirely sure why Nolan compares the golden rule and Xenia as almost the same thing. They are actually very different. The golden rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Whereas Xenia or Zeus's law says that you must treat others with hospitality because you might be entertaining a god in disguise. And this is a concept that's all about hospitality. The golden rule isn't necessarily about just being hospitable. It's about treating others how you would want to be treated. So I have been struggling with trying to understand how those two things are the same. I don't think they are the same at all. So, but Christopher Nolan made this a very strong part of his story that he wrote for the Odyssey, and the way he approached all of this, the culture that he established in the world that he created for the film. But I don't think that it's the same at all. Also, Nolan asked these two questions. He asks, what defines civilization and what binds us together? So I think those are really good questions that I think this conversation was something that I think Nolan, I think he knew of Zhang Shu. That's why she was invited to be part of their press for the Odyssey. But I think he was even sort of taken aback by how she was really challenging him with these questions, really big ideas, talking about what defines civilization. Those are very big questions that I think he did his best to answer, but I don't think he also fully answered them either. And then Zhang Shu asked Nolan if Odysseus should repent for his pride, which is pretty fascinating to me because that in itself is a Christian concept, the idea of repentance, to change one's way or to change directions, to change direction. So I have questions about all of this. In the Greek world, my question is, what defines pride and what defines repentance? That would be the question. Those would be the questions that I would sort of use as a follow-up to that. And in their culture as outlined by Homer, because I don't know. So I'm asking these questions. Would one need to or expect to repent for his or her pride? Because maybe in that culture, pride was not something that you had to repent of. So that's something that I would really kind of want to dig more into that question. And Nolan in the interview responds to her with another question. They have a pretty good back and forth. He asks, quote, what difference would it make if he repented, unquote? And that if he did, Odysseus's repentance would be purely internal because the damage had already been done. Now, I don't expect Christopher Nolan to speak on repentance from a Christian perspective, as I don't believe that he is a Christian. From what I've read, he might have grown up Catholic, but I don't know that he what he believes currently. But the thing about repentance is that it is something that happens after a sin has already happened, and oftentimes it is both internal and external. You would actually be able to tell if someone had repented, if someone had we talk in the Christian world and Christianity about good fruit. You'd be able to see that. I again, I don't know that Christopher Nolan fundamentally understands some of these things he's talking about. In the interview, she asks him about wanting to Christianize the Odyssey, but I don't. First of all, I don't know. That's not what I got out of any of this. And then the second thing I would say is that I don't think Christopher Nolan could Christianize the Odyssey, because I don't think he understands Christianity at all. And so I think his concepts and ideas about it, I don't think he would understand even how to do that, if that was even something he would want to do. But yeah, so this interview I think was so good, because partially because Zhang Shu is not a professional film critic. I don't think professional film critics have any concept of asking these tough questions. I don't think they would feel like they could, even if they had these ideas in their head, even if they had these questions. I don't think they would even do it, because you don't want to upset Christopher Nolan. You don't want to upset the biggest filmmaker in Hollywood. I actually think the amateur film critic part of this interview and of Zhang Shu's approach to this is actually a big benefit, because she wasn't a big name, because she wasn't a professional film critic. She could ask these questions and be bold and not fear of some sort of retaliation from the studio or anything. So I think this is amazing. This is a great example of amateur film criticism and the value that somebody can bring, even if you are just a podcaster. If you're somebody who actually digs into reading through and analyzing something, that I think is, to Christopher Nolan's credit, he sat down with her and tried to answer her questions as best as possible, because I think Christopher Nolan, even with some of his, in my opinion, faults in some of the things that he talks about in this interview, and we'll get to some of the things I really disagree with him about, he's willing to sit down and speak with her and have a real adult intellectual conversation with her. So big kudos to both of them for actually engaging in this conversation and talking about some of these big ideas. I think it's a really very cool that this young lady, who is both an academic and a podcaster, really asked these thoughtful, meaningful, and tough questions to her. And Nolan did his best to honor that curiosity that she had, with his best attempt at having thoughtful answers in response. And the thing that happened in this interview that I was shocked by, just absolutely just kind of mind blown that this even happened, is that Zhang Shu asks Christopher Nolan about celebrating greatness and if we should apologize for it. And so this was the thing that I think I struggled with the most with this interview. Because my favorite part of Nolan's cinematic take on the Odyssey is when Odysseus returns to Ithaca and he takes out the suitors. There's a great fight sequence, and he's returning home, and you kind of want to see him, take out all these guys who have caused all this trouble for them. And so he's taken out the suitors and the people who have betrayed his kingdom and his family, and he does it with skill. He's cunning, he's smart. He came kind of in disguise and tried to pass himself as somebody else, so that pass himself off as somebody else so that nobody would recognize him. And he has a lot of strength, even though he's been through a ton of stuff. He's still got enough strength that he can do all these physical acts. And to me, that's great. Odysseus is great in that sequence. That whole sequence in itself is great. It's one of the best parts of the movie. So I guess my question for Christopher Nolan is, what's wrong with having a heroic character doing heroic things? What's wrong with having a character who is great doing great things? Why would we have to apologize for that? I think that's one of the strangest things I've ever heard anybody say. And in that same vein, does Christopher Nolan even really believe this? Does he truly believe that we need to apologize for greatness? Because I will tell you what, I don't believe for a second that Christopher Nolan, who probably is going to be nominated for Academy Awards, that's the whole reason why he did a lot of things he did with his movies, so he could be considered for the Academy Award categories and rules. I don't think he's going to get up on that stage and accept those awards and say, I'm sorry. I'm going to apologize for my greatness. He's not going to do that. He's not going to refuse to go to the ceremonies. He's not going to refuse those awards. He's going to get up there in his best suit and he is going to accept that award. And he's going to thank everybody who participated in the movie and did what they did to help him get to that great point. I don't think Christopher Nolan believes that for a second. I don't think he would have even made the movie if he thought we had to apologize for greatness. Why would you shoot in an entire movie in IMAX just to prove that you could do it if you thought you had to apologize for greatness? I don't understand it. It's the weirdest thing I've ever heard. So I don't think Christopher Nolan believes that at all. But what he says to her in response is he says, quote, yes, we do have to apologize for greatness because if we don't, the audience will reject greatness, unquote. Bizarre. First of all, I don't think that filmmakers, especially Christopher Nolan as a filmmaker, should be caring all that much about the audience when they are making the film. So first of all, I don't think we should care what the audience thinks if they're going to accept or reject anything. And that's talking about me as an audience member. I don't think the filmmaker should care about me at all. I don't think that should be the dictator for. I don't think I should be a dictator for how they make their film. And second, I would also argue that if you consider the audience, if you did consider the audience when making your film, most people, I would wager, want someone to cheer for. They want to see good triumph over evil. They want to see the bad guy get theirs, and they want to see people being great. So I fundamentally disagree with his notion that we do have to apologize for greatness. I thought that was one of the things that really stuck out to me and made me think a lot about Christopher Nolan's films and some of the way he approaches things, because I just don't believe that. I don't believe that we should have to apologize for greatness, and I don't even think Christopher Nolan believes that. So why would he have said that? It's very strange. And then also I just have the other questions. So when Nolan goes after amateur film critics for attacking the mechanisms of storytelling, I want to know who he's talking about, what he's referring to. So because I don't know where he is getting some of these things. He saw something that somebody said and he didn't like it. But I just don't understand why this whole thing is referring to the mechanisms and why he's specifically going after amateur film critics, because he's not going after he doesn't really, he says more things that are positive about professional film critics in that interview. And I just wonder if it's because those people have been giving him the accolades for so many years, and the amateur film critics are the ones who are giving him some pushback and really challenging him in some of these ways. And so just to kind of get back to talking about the tropes, because I feel that tropes should have been a little more prominent and maybe should have been hit a little harder in the Odyssey. And just to maybe try to connect the dots between the amateur film critics and the trope usage, and maybe the idea of it is not that the amateur film critics, whoever these people are, I don't think they necessarily judged Nolan's Odyssey because he used the tropes. I think most of the people who had issues with the Odyssey had issues with the tropes that he did use. I think that's more of what's happening here, because I have, like I said, gone through a bunch of interviews, reviews, and trying to figure out what other people have issues with. I've watched videos on people criticizing the armor and criticizing the costumes and criticizing the locations and the way that they approached, the palace not having any color. I've seen all kinds of criticism. I've even watched a couple of really good videos about the photography and how a lot of the shots are very blurry, and there's a reason for that. And if that could even be helped. So there's a lot of technical things that people could talk about. I have my own personal issues with the Odyssey after even seeing it 3 times. So I don't think the issue is the use of tropes. I think it's the way that tropes were used, and I think it's the aspect of the fact that the tropes that he did use maybe had some problems that people didn't quite care for. So just to reference some examples, and again, I'm pulling these from tvtropes.org, which I think is an incredible resource when you're talking about this subject. So the first one I want to talk about real quick is adaptational angst upgrade. And you'll find all these tropes on tvtropes.org. And this means sometimes when Hollywood decides to do a movie adaptation, they'll try to make a character more interesting by giving them some angst not present or discussed in the book. And the reasons vary for this. It makes the character easier to empathize with. It is an attempt to avert an invincible hero. It adds more conflict to the story, etc. Often used to add more character development. So some people may have had a problem with the movie adaptation portion of this. Maybe they were big fans of the Homer poem and they didn't like the way that Christopher Nolan adapted this. That's fair. I mean, when you're working with an adaptation, you're not going to be able to please everybody. So maybe people didn't like the way he changed Odysseus. From my understanding, Odysseus is very different in the actual poem itself. So the trope that he used to change Odysseus's character and maybe some other characters in the film, maybe people had an issue with that. There's another trope called adaptational nice guy. And this trope is when a character is made nicer or at least a bit more sympathetic in an adaptation than they were in the source material. So this could also apply to Odysseus as well. For example, Odysseus is far less arrogant, impulsive, and cruel humored than in the original Homer poem, with a lot less emphasis on his fatal flaw of hubris and character art of being brought down by a notch by the gods. So the amateur film critics may have had issues with the way he approached the character of Odysseus. I think that's fair. I've had issues even this summer as well with how adaptations have approached something that I loved. See the Millie Alcock Supergirl movie and Tom King's Woman of Tomorrow book. So there are things where if you're really passionate about the source material and then you go see a film that changes things, you might have some strong thoughts on that. So I think that's very valid. There's another trope called adaptation species change, where, and this is what that means. You read a book about a hero and his faithful pet, but when the book is adapted to film, the hero's pet has been changed into a different species. This is what is known as an adaptation species change. So, for example, in the Odyssey, in the original poem, Circe was the child of the sun god Helios and the nymph Percy. Here, she's implied to be just a mortal woman who was granted her magic by the gods. So I've had conversations with friends who are really passionate about Greek gods and Greek mythology and had real issues with some of the ladies in the movie, like Circe and Calypso, for this very reason, that they were not portrayed in a way that they were in the Homer poem and other aspects of Greek mythology. Also, a very valid criticism of the adaptation portion of this film. There's also something called adaptation amalgamation, which is basically when there is a character who's been added to something. For example, Sinon isn't a character from the Odyssey, but from Virgil's the Aeneid, I think is how that's pronounced. Let me know if that's not right. But if you're confused about the Iliad and the the other source material that's been added to the Odyssey that wasn't there before, that's also a very valid criticism of adaptation. So I'm not gonna dismiss anybody for having those criticisms. There's another trope called adapted out. And what that means is when a work is being adapted, liberties with the original will have to be taken. Due to time or length constraints, some things may have to be taken out. Sometimes it involves taking out a character or plot element that was very important with in the original story. So the Odyssey, I believe, was 2 hours and 52 minutes long. So you can't probably just in terms of the timing of the movie, you probably couldn't add everything in there. So, for example, the island of the lotus eaters is cut from the movie, although the lotus flowers do appear in the film. During the incident with the Cyclops Polyphemus, the moment when Odysseus calls himself nobody, that was taken out. A lot of people had issues with that. A lot of people wanted that to be in the movie. Also, Achilles doesn't appear in the underworld sequence. People were surprised that that was removed and that other things were changed about that sequence. That is also an adaptation criticism that I think is pretty valid. There's also a TV, well, not just a TV trope, a TV and movie trope called ambiguous situation, where a certain situation is so ambiguous that the audience can't know for sure what's going on. So, for example, in the Odyssey, it is unclear as to whether or not Athena, the Athena that repeatedly appears before Odysseus, is truly the goddess of wisdom or simply a hallucination born out of his guilt. The things about that trope is that, I think personally, I kind of like the idea that it's open-ended, and I can have a conversation with somebody about, well, what do you think about Athena? How did you read that? How did you interpret that? But I can see how other people would be frustrated about that if they wanted to see the goddess Athena in this movie. They maybe didn't want it to be open-ended. There's another trope called devil but no god, and this means works of fantasy frequently contain a powerful evil spiritual being who's behind most or all of the evil in the world, a Satan or satanic figure or chief god of evil. This devil is a very real being, is a very real being with followers, worshipers, and real power, who takes an active hand in making trouble for the world. But in an odd twist, a lot of the stories leave out the devil's good counterpart. Either there is no benevolent God, or he's only talked about and never actually does anything. This is particularly egregious if the series makes a big deal of the balance between good and evil. So in the Odyssey, the Greek gods do not directly appear on screen, save for Athena in a vision to Odysseus, who may or may not be real, but the world is full of monsters, giants, sirens, witches, and the underworld directly exists as a place from which the spirits of the dead can be summoned. So again, if you're a person who's really into Greek mythology, your criticism of the trope may not be that the tropes exist, but maybe you didn't use the trope in the way that it should be used. Maybe people really just wanted to see those Greek mythological characters. And I'll go through a couple of other ones just to kind of drive this point home. The next one, the other trope that I thought was interesting related to the Odyssey, was called maybe magic, maybe mundane. And this trope talks about how sometimes you can track down the monster and pull the rubber mask off to reveal the janitor. Sometimes you try that and the monster gobbles you up. Sometimes you don't get either way. You are left with nothing except the tracks, the sightings, and hypotheses. Two characters can argue for the alternative explanation, supernatural or naturalistic, without either one of them carrying the idiot ball. I love that TV tropes includes other tropes within descriptions of the tropes. And in regard to the Odyssey, this trope sort of plays out in some of these ways. So while there are mythological creatures featured in the film, the mythological gods don't make an appearance except for maybe Athena, who could be or could maybe not be the real Athena. The other major gods who made appearances, like Zeus and Poseidon, are only sort of alluded to in the original epic poem by Homer. Circe and Calypso are actually goddesses, but in the movie, how would you even know that? Because they're not treated as such. They're not really referred to as such. So, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who is really big into Greek mythology, and some of these were things that she brought up as criticisms and had real objections to. So, as an amateur film critic, these are the tropes that she would have brought to the attention, not necessarily because Christopher Nolan had tropes in the movie, but because these were tropes that were not utilized in any kind of real way. There's another trope that I thought was very interesting. There's one called precision F strike. And a precision F strike is when a character suddenly swears in an uncharacteristically strong manner, or when a swear is unexpectedly used in work with mild language. So, for example, the F word, the F bomb, is used twice in the Odyssey, and for me, that was jarring. That was something that I think maybe made the movie worse. And I know there was a lot of discussion about people not being happy with the more modern take on the language, colloquialisms, Telemachus referring to uh, uh, Odysseus as his dad, things like that. I didn't have much of a problem with that portion, but having an F bomb a couple of times in the movie, that did not make me feel like I was in ancient Greece. So I think that is a very valid criticism, that some of the way that the writing was done really didn't put me in that time period where I was supposed to believe that I was in a very removed time period, that I wasn't supposed to be in the modern times. I was supposed to be in some ancient time, and I didn't feel like I was, because they dropped the F bomb a couple of times. It made me feel like I was in modern day, maybe modern day Greece, but not ancient Greece. So I think that's a trope that could have been looked at. There's another one called the Queen's Latin. This trope is used in film and television fiction set in the past, or a fantasy counterpart culture heavily based on the past, where a character speaks with British accents, even though the film is not set in Britain and the characters are not British. So this I think sort of relates to the language portion of the film. People were speaking in all kinds of different, not accents per se, but that we were supposed to believe these people were Greek. None of them spoke in any kind of Greek accent. There's that strange scene where they say, "We are Greeks from Ithaca," talking to a man who is actually speaking Greek. This is the dumbest thing I've ever seen in a Christopher Nolan movie, in any of his films. That's right up there with the Talia al Ghul death scene in The Dark Knight Rises. And I love The Dark Knight Rises, but that death scene is pretty bad. That situation where they say we're Greeks from Ithaca, and needing an interpreter to talk to a man speaking in native Greek, was the strangest thing I've ever seen in my whole life. So those are the kind of things that I think are very valid criticisms. I'm going to mention two more. So, this penultimate trope that I'm going to talk about is something called shown their work. And this one talks about how, although many talents in fictional media show they don't do their research, some actually did. In fact, sometimes they learned so much and worked so hard to learn it, and it would hardly seem fitting to just not show it off. The show their work trope comes in when the creators tweak their stories to show the viewer or reader what they have learned. The trick is to do it so this advances the story instead of stopping it cold. When it's done right in a well-made work, art awards for its educational value can be just as nifty as the artistic awards. So the example related to the Odyssey here would be, while the film's armor doesn't even make an attempt at being historically accurate, the weapons are actually pretty faithful to Bronze Age history. And a lot of people have mentioned Odysseus' sword in the movie is actually pretty accurate for the time period and what it's supposed to be based in terms of like a real historical sword. I don't have any particular expertise in this area, so I'll have to rely on other people to let me know about the historical accuracy of the sword. But I have seen a lot of criticism about the fact that it seems like they didn't make an effort or an attempt with some of the armor, the costumes, things like that, which I think you could say, well, this is not maybe there's some objections to it, like, oh, this is not a real story. This is maybe not supposed, it doesn't have to be historical. It can just be a fantasy. But I think some of the problems that I had with the Odyssey was that I had a really hard time believing I was in ancient Greece, believing this was a different setting and a different culture. I even had a hard time. I know a lot of people criticize the casting, and I had problems with the casting, but not for the reasons a lot of people think. I had more of the problem with the casting in that I had a hard time believing the people who were the actors in the movie were those characters. So when I saw Odysseus, all I saw was Matt Damon. When I saw Penelope, that was Anne Hathaway. These were not people who were making me believe they were the characters. All I was seeing were the actors. They were so big names, and the press and the media had made such a big deal of them in terms of the actors that I had a hard time really putting myself in this story because all I saw were the actors. And I think that goes back to the fact that the costumes really didn't put me in there. The language didn't put me in there. The way they talked didn't put me in there. Even the locations didn't put me in that time, place, and story and setting. And so I had a really hard time putting myself in ancient Greece because of it. So that's a trope that I think is a very valid criticism. And then the last one that I wanted to mention is a trope called war is hell. So when this theme is in play, war is an infernal, nasty, traumatizing nightmare, and anyone who comes out of it alive will end up as a shell-shocked veteran. So in the Odyssey, there is no glory in the Trojan War because you cannot celebrate greatness in Nolan's Odyssey from his perspective. And when the survivors reflect on the Trojan War, they recall only 10 years of rotting on the beach outside of Troy, seeing friends and comrades die. And then the victory is no better, just a horrific slaughter of innocents. So I say all that to say that I don't think the problem with Nolan's Odyssey is the use of tropes. I think some people wanted there to be tropes, and he just either didn't use the tropes they wanted, or he didn't lean on them more effectively. And I think when you're talking about tropes, I think that's something to put into consideration, because I don't think that any amateur film critic was criticizing the movie because of the use of tropes. I agree with Nolan that tropes are a great way to tell a story. I don't think you have to do them the same every time. You can use them as a baseline for how you tell the story, and then sort of use twists and turns to manipulate the story as you go based on the tropes. But I don't think anyone is criticizing the Odyssey because it has tropes. So I really wish Christopher Nolan had expanded on that. And if I had been Zhang Shu, I would have wanted to press him a little harder on his comment about mechanisms and tropes. If I ever get to meet Christopher Nolan, I will immediately bring up his use of mechanisms. I wanted to know more about what he was referring to in that way. So I think there is still question. There are still questions, I think, to be asked about this conversation that was had. And so I just wanted to sort of end this conversation because I don't really have I don't think I'm going to have anything valuable to add about a review of the Odyssey, because I'm not as passionate about it to talk about things. I have a lot of criticisms about the way that IMAX was used. I don't think it was used to its fullest effect. That was kind of my most disappointing thing that I came out of the movie, even after seeing it 3 times. I feel like if you're going to shoot an entire movie in IMAX, I want it to make me feel like I'm in the movie. And maybe if people saw the 70 millimeter IMAX, maybe they felt like that format really put them into the film. But I didn't get that anytime I saw it in just the Limax that I saw it in, which was the digital version of IMAX. I never felt like it was putting me in it. There are Christopher Nolan movies that made me feel like that. I remember seeing The Dark Knight in IMAX when it came out in 2008. I did see it in a 70 millimeter IMAX theater. I saw it at the Mall of Georgia outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And that first shot of the building. It was kind of the first shot of The Dark Knight is not some big impressive shot, but that shot I remember being wowed at in the 70 millimeter IMAX. And so I think Christopher Nolan can utilize IMAX very effectively. I just don't know that he did that as well as maybe he could have in the Odyssey. There were a couple of shots that I thought were really great. There's a push in from the ocean to the beach where we can see the Trojan horse and the Trojan army coming towards it to approach the Trojan horse. That I thought was a really nice IMAX shot. And I will applaud the folks, the camera operators and the cinematographer for actually getting the IMAX camera near water. Sometimes it looked like it was in the water. That would have terrified me. I would have been so worried that it would have damaged the camera putting it in water. So they did try to do some ambitious things with the IMAX camera. And obviously, there were limitations. They could only shoot about 3 minutes at a time, and then they would have to change film. So that must have been so frustrating. So it is a cinematic achievement what they did. I just think that moving forward, I think if people are going to start doing more of this, I would love to see filmmakers really utilize the IMAX format. I remember growing up seeing nature films shot in IMAX, IMAX going over the Grand Canyon or going over a rainforest or something. That can be used to a great effect to make you feel like you're in that setting. And I don't really feel like the Odyssey really did that. And I will say that after seeing it 3 times, it did change for me. I didn't love the Odyssey on the first viewing. Most of my criticism was about the IMAX camera and the way it was used. And then I guess the second criticism I would have had on my first viewing is I thought the writing wasn't great, and I kind of still feel like the writing wasn't the strongest. But I did feel like there was so much dialogue in that first viewing. I was blown back about how much dialogue there was at the kind of near the beginning of the movie, a lot of exposition. But on the second and third viewings, the things that bothered me at first didn't bother me much anymore. So I was able to appreciate it for what it was, even though I had those criticisms about the writing and the use of the IMAX camera. So, I still value what Christopher Nolan and his team achieved with this film, with the Odyssey, and they did something nobody else had done before. They were actually able to shoot dialogue scenes using their blimp solution that they had come up with, and they're probably paving the way for future films to be shot entirely in IMAX. I don't think this is the last time that we are ever going to see this. I think this is going to happen more often now that they've sort of cracked the code on how to do this. So I think this is something that's going to change filmmaking, and I think we're maybe hopefully going to see more event movies, event films. I think that's what's driving people back to the theater. I saw the Odyssey kind of in its third week of being in theaters when I saw it for the third time in IMAX, and the theater was still packed. I haven't seen people go to the movies like this in a long time, probably since the Barbenheimer summer. So the last Christopher Nolan movie that came out, Oppenheimer, had got people to the theater too. So I think Christopher Nolan deserves credit for making films feel like an event that you would be left out of the conversation. You'd have a little bit of FOMO if you didn't go see it. And I think that's what the film industry has been lacking. And I think that's really driving people to go back to the theaters. And I'm glad to see that experience come back and people being excited to go to the movies again. I think there have been a couple of movies this summer that have done that. I know the Spider-Man movie that also has Tom Holland in it with Zendaya and John Bernthal. They're really crushing it this summer, the summer of 2026. Lots of movies with them in it. But I think that's been really nice to see. So even for me, the Odyssey is not the best Christopher Nolan film I have ever seen. I have seen better Christopher Nolan movies. I have my favorites, and that's subjective for everybody. Everybody has probably their favorite Christopher Nolan film, and there's probably Christopher Nolan films I would put pretty high above the Odyssey. I don't think it is the best one that he has ever done. But even if it was his greatest movie. Even if this was the greatest Nolan movie ever made, I wouldn't want him to apologize for it.